It's good to be back. I think we did the count 2 years ago. I did this. So I've updated some of the charts. We'll give you at least some background on a couple of programs we're doing and talk a little bit about some of the open architecture work we've been doing. One, it's always good to be back here. Two, it's great to see some familiar faces in the audience. We'll catch up afterwards. The plan today is kind of give you a little bit of history or background of how we got started, because there's a lot of folks out there always want to know, hey, what's the secret sauce of going rapid? And I'll give you some insight into that. Touch on our model, and then a quick program update on a handful of programs. All right, next chart. Three individuals showing up here were probably the founders of what's the Air Force Rapid Capabilities today. Pete Aldridge was AT&L at the time. Dr. Jim Roach was the Secretary of the Air Force at the time. And General John Jumper was the chief at the time. A lot of conversations of how frustrated they were with both the requirements processes and the acquisition processes. And they were looking to do something different. And so what they ended up doing, probably in about the 2001 timeframe, asked a handful of folks to put together what they thought the model would look like and how one would do things a little bit quicker. Mostly focused on the acquisition, but definitely leveraging a more streamlined requirements process. And so what you see is, on the far left, we stole and plagiarized some of the models that existed, because this nation and industry and actually government agencies have done streamlined and tailored acquisition and requirements process for years. I pick a little bit from the Lockheed Skunk Works model. Kelly Johnson shown up there. He has 15 rules. We typically use 10 of those 15. For the most part, the National Reconnaissance Office in the early days was very streamlined and got things done fairly quickly. And again, both from a requirements as well as an acquisition process point of view. And then you see on the far right kind of the top level objectives that we were asked to go do. And that's in our charter. We have essentially what is a charter for the Air Force Rapid Capabilities Office. It simply has a number of fairly simple objectives. We're run by a board of directors. We're updating the charter based on the new NDAA that basically broke apart AT&L. But fundamentally, we work for 4 individuals: AT&L, now ANS, the Secretary of the Air Force, the Chief Staff of the Air Force, and SAF-AQ. That's our board of directors. That's who provides the governance and oversight and essentially how we execute in a more streamlined fashion. I won't go through all those objectives, but suffice it to say is deliver some critical capability, try to expedite how you do the performance of that delivery, experiment in the bounds of both statute and I would say the regulations that we typically see today, and I'll touch on what that means from 5,000. Everybody says, well, you must have a waiver of not using 5,000. No, we typically turn to the areas that talk about tailoring and streamlining inside 5,000. We codified that in the charter that we wrote, and essentially we follow all the FARs, DFARs, and 5,000, but in a very tailored and streamlined fashion. And then finally, and this is the part that really gets at the codification of the charter, challenge those traditional approaches out there and act as an agent of change. And if you're a good policy or process, we follow it. If you're not, we avoid you. And a lot of folks out there believe they should not be streamlined out. Just ask them. Next chart. So here's our model. Again, some of these, if you're familiar with NRO in the early days, Skunk Works, and even other organizations, both in the government and industry, you'd get a sense that it really comes down to a handful of things. Access. Access is access to senior leaders to make a decision. Building weapon systems are complex. You will run into problems. You've got to manage through those problems, but the most important thing is don't dwell on it. Don't sit back and wait for someone else to make a decision. Bring that information forward and get the decision makers to help you move forward. And like anything, it's a risky business out there, but the more important piece is manage the risk and then inform the senior leadership, but move forward in a manner that actually gets the weapon system delivered. Access to, I'll say, the security pieces out there. We lean heavily on Air Force OSI. They help us through most of the programs that we do, and that access, in my mind, is fairly critical in the execution of certainly any of the Defense Department type weapon systems, but more important, associated with actually securing the information we don't want to have our adversaries to get, and or securing information that makes sense in having a capability for the future that you're not having to update or modernize based on a leak of information. Resources. Resources include people and funding. I'll start with the people. We're made up of both military, government civilians, and contractors. The organization's about 250 folks. We have about $30 billion in what I'll say is the FIDEP, and 13 of the programs are all in the ACAT-1 category. Think, MDAP-like systems out there. But the bottom line is we try to actually run the programs with the least resistance and least cost from the execution side. What I mean by that is we run about 2% of what's typically administrative cost to run a program office. The norm out there is about 10%, in some cases greater. So that really comes down to get the right people. So you try to hire the A-team on the military and government civilian side as well as contractor. Form those small empowered teams, and it's amazing how much you can get done with those teams. Resources I touched on, the funding. The biggest thing there is stabilized funding. Once you actually embark on a program of record, if you find that everybody wants to touch the funding knob, you find that you're doing these ebbing and flowing of a program that's very disruptive to the execution. And the one thing that's in our charter is, certainly within the Air Force, is our funding is stabilized once it's approved and appropriated by the Hill. Culture, and this is the key piece. Culture is not only at the lowest level, where you have program managers, contracting officers, financial managers, et cetera, trying to execute the program. That culture has to come from the warfighter. I'll just pick the B-21, but most folks that we talk to within the MAGCOMs, the warfighting MAGCOMs, is we always ask them, can we get a handful of your folks as a part of the program office to help us get through the execution of these major programs? We have 4 individuals, all bomber pilots, that come from Air Force Global Strike Command that are embedded in the B-21 program office. We've done that in other programs within the RCO, and I will tell you it works quite well for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, you get their expertise. That's a natural. So they're gonna inform you on things that they had lessons learned from, their expertise of flying, in this case, bombers over the years, and then help make the product better. 2, they're a nice, I'll say, lead-in to feeding back to the MAGCOM. The 4-star commanders out there typically lean heavily on the folks that are participating in the B-21, and I think it's great. I have a monthly meeting with General Rand to kind of go through all of the issues, and a key component of that is the discussion with the warfighters that are part of that program office. The culture. It's not only at the lower level, I mentioned that earlier, it's got to be at the senior level. If you don't have the culture of wanting to make decisions and helping the individuals execute the program, then you're destined to the processes that are in place, and it's probably taken at least 50 years to get all of those risk-averse processes in place of what folks are trying to undo today. And so in this particular case, that board of directors I mentioned earlier, those are the folks with that culture that help us break down the bureaucracy that gets in the way, and you actually get on with executing a program. Next chart. Just a quick, I'll say, gloss over a couple of programs that are more public within the RCO. On top, I show the X-37, the orbital test vehicle. Mission 5 is on orbit today. It launched last September. It was our first launch using a SpaceX Falcon 9. If you've not seen one of those take off and land, the very impressive part is watching that booster come back and land at the Cape. Got to see that in person on this particular launch. Very impressive technology. X-37, we've had 4 missions. I told you 5 is on orbit. Number 4, our first landing at Cape Canaveral, took place about a year ago in May, and everything worked flawlessly. And look forward to continued operations down there and cycling them through. We basically, if you went down to the Cape and went around, you'd see we kind of took over the old shuttle facility, modified that for the X-37s we have down there. On the bottom, B-21, just a quick snapshot. Fairly large program. People ask, how come you guys get this? Well, it was Secretary Gates at the time, and I want to say it's probably on the order of about 4 or 5 years ago, where he made the decision to, one, do the program, and two, have the RCO actually execute the program. Again, we follow as closely as we can as the RCO charter. And I mentioned those board of directors. Our chief is the only one that can change any requirements on there. So again, stable funding, stable requirements, and usually you have a recipe for success in a program. If you change any of those two, typically what you'll find is you'll start to have disruptive programs and not execute on a timetable or funding that you're expecting to go do. Everybody keeps saying, well, how come you don't, how come it's not up at Wright Pat? Well, it turns out we did something unique. The program office leadership is here in DC over at Boeing, but we leveraged on the order of about 80-ish folks from Wright Pat, the experts that are out there, engineers, contracting. So our chief engineer actually is used to work on F-22, F-35, B-2 in the old days. He's now associated with what we're doing. So we bring in not only, I'll say, the expertise in the local area here, but also at the, in this case, Life Cycle Management Center, specifically at Wright Pat, to help us build this bomber. And we're also leveraging the great folks from Tinker, and we've got folks already in the Sustainment Center associated with not only the program office, but also down at Melbourne, Florida, where the engineering team from Northrop is doing all the heavy lifting. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the open architecture work we're doing. Open Mission Systems, or OMS, down at the bottom. The B-21 will be fully OMS compliant. Won't go into a lot of detail there, but the bottom line is, one of the things that what we found over time is, if you were going to do some level of opening up systems and trying to define an ICD without having the government be too, I'll say, pushy, if you will, you get industry, and we had 4 consortium members help us do this through the use of a federally funded research and development center called MIT Lincoln Laboratory. They helped us form up what I'll say is the standard, and I'll get into this a little bit later, but the bottom line is, if you can define up front the standards of how you would want to build a system that truly should be open, with certainly the help of industry, what you find is you do have a secret for success in actually defining the interface control document up front, but more important, for folks that have to integrate on that system, it is much easier. And time scales are about 50% from, I'll say, a schedule point of view, and in most cases, at least 50% in cost, and that's really associated with the time savings. Next chart, please. Must be a big picture. Okay, I talked a little bit about some of the open architecture work. I'd like to touch in a little bit more detail. One, the standards we worked, and two, how we integrate that into a particular system that we referred to as Common Mission Control Center. The 2 standards out there were UCI and OMS. I mentioned OMS earlier, but UCI, Universal Command and Control Interface Standard. It's a fairly easy standard. And why I say it's easy is you use it at home almost every single day. And what I mean by that is, if you're familiar with logging onto your PC, you have things called Internet Protocol 6. Message format in there is XML, HTML types of message format. So the idea was, if it works that well, then why wouldn't we apply that to military systems? So the biggest difference between the UCI standard and what you enjoy when you go home and log onto a PC is the messages that we use are different. They're more militarized than you'd see for what you'd see at home. And in this case, it didn't take long for us to come up with a set of militarized messages that make sense. Velocity, altitude, things of that nature. And once we got the standard bit, we said, well, this is great, got a book of standards, so what do we do now? And what we found was, geez, having that book of standards isn't everything. You've really got to go prototype or demonstrate that that standard works. And so we had the 4 consortium members on contract, asked them to go do an integration. Lo and behold, like anything, you bring in a bunch of servers, build the enclave, and load it up with UCI. And then they brought in a slew of algorithms to where they could actually share this information. And so I'll give you just one example that you'd typically use at home. If you logged on to Travelocity or Expedia or something like that, just to go on vacation, In the old days, you'd have to call up the rental car companies and sort through all that. In the old days, you have to call up every airline, find out which was the best price and where you want to go, timing and all that. Now you've got an algorithm that can actually digest all that information in a manner that you care about, not what each company cares about, in a manner of what meets your needs as opposed to other folks' needs. And that's the type of algorithms that they were creating in this environment. What we found was, wow, it worked. I mean, you could move data quite easily. And various industry partners out there, which would have done it differently from a more proprietary point of view, all of a sudden you're sharing information that's being generated by someone else's algorithm, but you could digest that and crunch it in a manner that makes sense for your algorithm. And it worked. So Common Mission Control Center, when we showed the chief staff at the time, it was General Welsh, he's like, Waldo, we got to get this out to the field. Can't we get this out to some of the warfighting? Answer is yes. So he helped us get it out to Beale Air Force Base. We had it parked literally next to DGS-2. The primary goal out there was to actually prototype this with the folks that would come from the Air Force and do command and control type activities to help, I'll say, elevate the game, if you will, of this open architecture system using algorithms that industry was creating. I think we're above 65 algorithms today. Some of the key ones are mission planning, and I'll say dynamic retasking, not from the AOC sense, but from a sense of managing near real-time information flow off of mission plans as well as sensors and both kinetic and non-kinetic means on platforms. Very successful. OMS is a version of trying to open up the avionics bus. So think of individual platforms out there that would want to have a subsystem vendor bring a new system, bring a new technology on, and the hardest part is really getting the interfaces to talk to each other. Once you break down the interface like OMS did, it's fairly easy to actually integrate a new system on a platform because you don't have to spend a year discussing what the interface standard is or adapting your system to that, which takes a lot of engineering hours and complexity. So the bottom line was you couple those two service-oriented architectures, think what I talked about earlier about that UCI standard, couple it with open architecture that's in an air vehicle, space vehicle, it doesn't really matter, and you get those two working together, and now you're getting, I'll say at the foundational level of what General Goldfein's been talking about for quite some time, multi-domain command and control. And the idea here is you're sharing information that you naturally do every single day of your life, whether it's on internet or your cars or Bluetooth, those types of standards we should be applying regularly to a militarized system. Now, I always get asked this question, well, aren't there vulnerabilities? Yes, absolutely. And you've got to actually, I'll say, engineer in so you're not as vulnerable as the adversary would want you to go be. The hardest part about getting all these standards, I'll say the interface that's associated with assurance, IA standards, that was the toughest part. And it's amazing, each industry partner out there had a variation of how they handled IA. So the best part about having a consortium is bringing in good ideas on how one would do security on networks and on command and control systems similar to what CMCC's done. We had a number of folks out there we worked with to be able to, I'll say, wrap the standard around an existing system. So if you wanted to do that, you could do it on DCGS, you could do it on AOC, Air Operations Center. You can do that just to move the data. And it's amazing how fast and how easily it is to move the data back and forth between a system like an Air Operations Center and the common operating picture you'd get from like a CMCC. And just that sharing alone makes decision making for those that are the commanders out there in the field a much easier job. Okay, I think I'm done with that. Next chart. I think this might be my last chart. And then I'll open it up for questions. Bottom line is we've been in this business now in rapid acquisition, probably going on about 15 years. We've had lots of help from others. The board of directors is who I mentioned earlier, and I will tell you that culture at that level exists today. The folks I'm working with, Ms. Lord, Dr. Wilson, General Goldfein, and Dr. Roper are very, very much in tune with the culture that I mentioned earlier and are very helpful in us doing our execution. So, without further ado, I will open it up for questions. Sir.
Bill Sweetman from Norfolk Grumman. Please we put the microphone. Oh, sorry. Bill Sweetman from Norfolk Grumman. I'm not obviously asking you to name names, but are there things that you've done that you've had learning experiences from, that things have not gone well, and what have been the sort of decision points as to fix that? I'm just thinking back. You're talking about Kelly Johnson, and I'm remembering the history of Kelly Johnson actually recommending a program be cancelled because it wasn't going to meet the requirement.
That's right. Yes, we're not immune from what I would say is the warts associated with complex systems. And we've had like software, hardware issues that had to be resolved. But I think that the key is understanding, I'll say, the engineering detail of that particular flaw, understand what the fix is, and in most cases there's a variety of different options you have to move forward, some of which could include terminating the program. But in most cases, if it's a fundamental flaw between, I'll pick on software, you move on to what the solution looks like, you make a decision, and literally move out in the execution of that program. In most cases, you still have more issues to resolve. Building weapon systems are very complex. And the one thing you can't avoid is the systems engineering associated with building these complex systems. You do have to be mindful of that level of engineering detail, both on the software and hardware side, and the integration thereof. So in my mind, it's all about the understanding of the flaw, and then the options that you want to bring forward from either the engineering point of view or the business point of view, and make a decision and move on. Ma'am?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sandra Irwin with Space News. I wanted to ask you about the Air Force creating a Space Rapid Capabilities Office. We were told that it's going to be modeled after your office. So what kind of work have you done with them so far? What kind of advice are you giving them? And what kind of challenges do you foresee in doing rapid capabilities in space?
Yeah, good question.
Thanks.
So I've talked a number of times to General Raymond, General Thompson, who's the SMC commander. And what you just saw up here of the fundamental baseline, if you were, the foundation, is what I've told them. There's a number of things that they borrowed from us. One is the charter. I'd say the thought, if you look at the NDA that actually established the Space RCO, it's not quite as tailored or streamlined as what we have in our charter associated with 5000, but it's as close as one could get through the language in there. And there is no, there's no simple solution in creating an organization that you would want to streamline instantaneously. And so I've talked, like I said, General Raymond, General Thompson. The idea is probably take about at least 6 months or so to get going, get your footing going. But the more important piece is what's their task at hand? What are they supposed to build? To me, that's the most important piece. Once you get a feel for the weapon system, or in this case, the space system you want to go build, then you can start populating with the right folks and getting the right contracting officers and financial managers, et cetera, program managers. The one thing they asked was, hey, how many folks do you have and can we steal some? The answer, of course, is, well, not the ones that are working for me, but I've got a whole list of folks out there that certainly were alumni, and I gave them a number of names associated with head of contracting, head of financial management, et cetera, and they're hiring those folks to try to instill the same culture.
The X-37 program, is that something that would be potentially going to space?
Well, it's already in space.
I mean,
so,
the management.
Yeah, not that I know of, unless you've heard something.
Thank you.
I think it's staying with us for at least a little bit longer. Again, I think it's really more associated with one, the establishment and getting your footing and foundation right, knowing what your task at hand is, building around what you're supposed to go build, literally, and then move out on there. And if the X-37 is supposed to transition, I'll salute smartly. But right now, I've not been told that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Morning, Colin Clark, Breaking Defense. You talked about maintaining funding stability. Now, I understand on the requirement side how you do that. You say, no, we're not changing that.
Right.
But how do you keep the brilliant fingers of Congress out of your wallet?
Talking to them, letting them know how the program's going.
You don't take anyone hostage? Or
No. You let them know how the program's going and the importance of maintaining the stability of the funding, and there's a variation of appropriations out there that they have to be mindful of and we have to be mindful of. And again, if they touch the knob when it comes to funding, then that's on them. But the point is, they should not be surprised as to the impact of the program if they were going to touch the funding. The funding stability I was talking about does really get with the Hill, but in general, I'll say the charter we have written, they don't have to follow. And so whatever makes sense for them, depending on year of execution or future years, they're going to make their own call. But it won't be because we did not share with them what we think the current execution looks like and what we believe the impact will look like in the future if the funding is not given.
Do they usually leave you alone when
Yes.
you make those explanations?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Sir?
Good morning. John Turpak, Air Force Magazine. How big is too big for a
Good question.
program? B-21 is very large.
Yes.
If you can be successful at that, why couldn't you be successful at something the size of F-35 or PCA or something like that?
Good question. We always get asked not only the size of the program, but the growth of the office. And some of the examples I showed up there, like the National Reconnaissance Office, they were fairly small in the early days, very small in the early days. If you went out to Chantilly, you'd see they've got a number of towers out there. So I think there is a knee in the curve. I can't tell you precisely what that looks like when an organization gets too big and not being able to actually do things rapidly. But I'll give you my flavor, and I always say this at Defense Acquisition University when I go out and talk to them. I break out, and I'll pick more on the acquisition piece of this. There's like three major components. There's certainly a lot more than that, but three major components. And I'll start at the last one. It's what I call the acquisition physics. So you've got to go build something. I don't know if it's an airplane, a spacecraft, a ship, whatever. That acquisition physics, you've got to get right. You're not going to cut too many corners on the systems engineering of that complex design without paying a huge penalty once you go into production or fielding. So that one you got to get right, and I'd say that's fairly constant. It takes airplanes, anywhere from 3 to 5 years to get through what I'll say is a build. Now, back to the first two. Simply this: make a decision, get on contract. We spend an inordinate amount of time in those two areas hand-wringing over what we should go do, and I'll pick on the make a decision. We call them analysis of alternatives, front-end assessments. We wrap a label around it and say that's the most important piece. If we get that wrong, the rest doesn't matter. I would say if you don't do that in a timely fashion, then you're helping the adversaries because you're delaying making the decision of a weapon system they would either have to counter or would make you stronger. And that could take 2, 3, sometimes no one makes a decision. The second one is get on contract. Again, it's the tool that allows you to go do the acquisition physics. There's a variety of different tools out there and contracting mechanisms by which you can choose. Pick the one that makes sense for the program you're about ready to go do the acquisition physics on and get on with it. Again, it takes, I think, too long to actually get on contract. We spend a lot of time debating on should it be cost plus, fixed price. In my mind, it depends on the weapon system you're trying to build. That's the tool you should use to whatever risk it's associated with the acquisition physics portion. If you took those first two and just cut them in half and just said, I'm going to try to get this done in half the time it normally takes, you're now getting anywhere from 2 to 4 years of savings in just that front end, and that is the time it takes to do the acquisition physics. So the acceleration doesn't happen in the area of building the complex design. Acceleration is getting on with it, and then you'll see that acceleration of the weapon system delivery. Just a thought. Again, I'll say the requirements process and the acquisition process is fairly complicated. I summarize in those three main parts. Sir?
Jeff Fine from Janes. You mentioned two of the programs, pretty well-known programs, X-37 and B-21. 28 other programs. Could you maybe talk about a couple of those, and which ones are rapid that are actually have made their way out there?
I'd say not many. I did touch on a couple others in there, specifically in the area of our open architecture work. There's a handful of programs there that we're managing. In my mind, the two big ones represent what I would say is the normal acquisition processes you got to go through. I mentioned earlier, make a decision, get on contract, and do the acquisition physics. All the other programs that we manage fit into what I'll say is kind of a family of systems. You've seen me talk about that. You've seen others talk about that. The family of systems is in my mind, all about the efficiency of an integrated family as opposed to disparate stovepipes that don't talk to each other. Key piece is associated with the movement of data. And again, what we enjoy at home today on the movement of data is what we're attempting to do with that family of systems. Hopefully that answered the question.
Thank you.
Yep. Ma'am?
Hi, sir. Courtney Albin with Inside the Air Force. You talked a little bit about about the Air Force's expansion of using the rapid acquisition authorities with the Space RCO and then just more broadly in the Air Force. And I guess I'm curious how that benefits your office. Does it help you to stay small and focused if they're applying that elsewhere? And then a second question is the B-21, have you achieved the CDR on that? And if not, do you expect you'll be able to tell us when you do?
I'll start with the latter and hopefully address the first question. We haven't done CDR yet. We are on our way to critical design review. I suspect it'll be done before the end of the year. That's our plan today. Building, like I said, building weapon systems like the B-21 in development phase, everything, you need the right engineers to create the drawings, get that through the process to a point where you're actually about ready to cut metal, so to speak. And we're in that phase today. We've been through the preliminary design review, and so we're on a path to go into a more critical design and move on with the production of not only the test aircraft, but if I had my way, make sure that we get the development done properly leading up to an on-time start of production. So from my perspective, this is about producing 100 bombers, not about just getting through development. Development is a phase that leads into the fielding of this critical need. So my focus is getting the production started, but I can't do that until we understand what the design looks like. So I'm not focused on just the development only. I'm looking at the bigger program, but I got to get development done properly. And we may take the time needed to ensure that the drawings are done right, the engineering is done right. I mentioned that earlier, leading up to the first test aircraft that would be built and then lead into, again, production decisions. The first one was, remind me again?
Yeah, just the Air Force's adoption of more rapid acquisition authorities and like the Space RCO as an example. Does that help? Does that benefit your office and allow you to kind of stay small and focused on?
I think so. I think others, again, it's not, I was sharing this earlier with some other folks, it's not the label on the door that actually makes you rapid. It's the culture. And I think most folks that work in, I'll say, program offices are the like culture. They don't wake up in the morning going, I wonder how I can slow the program down and cost the taxpayer more money. They just don't do it that way. It's usually the processes wrapped around that review, literally a process that slows it down and adds time because of the risk aversion. So in my mind, it is a good thing that people are out there creating their version of a rapid capabilities office. Army created one, the Navy's got one called MACO, the Marine Corps has got their version of it, the Space RCO just stood up through the NDAA. In general, I think it's good. I mean, I think it's a message that, hey, maybe we've been too risk averse. And maybe it's time to take on a little bit more risk and get out in front of the adversary. I think that's really the takeaway. And has it helped me? I'd say a little bit. Let those folks do some of the work. But the SPOs that are out there today, they don't need to be called an RCO. They have all the tools they need. It's just a matter of implementing those tools.
Paula Trimble, Lewis Burke Associates. Undersecretary of Defense Mike Griffin has talked repeatedly about, kind of two primary areas. One, hypersonics, and the need to advance that capability, and even larger than that, the need to get outside of our processes. Our bureaucratic processes are killing us in acquisition. So I was hoping you could talk about your role, the role of the Air Force Rapid Capabilities Office in accelerating the hypersonics capability, and then maybe more importantly, how do you institutionalize this RCO model in the department? Because if they're always just a separate organization, it will not change the overall structure.
So I've not been asked to do hypersonics. Doesn't mean we can't do prototyping and I'll say demonstrations such that I think Dr. Griffin wants to go do. He and I have talked at length on some of the efforts that I'm executing. He's been very supportive, specifically of the X-37. So we're in tune with what he's doing. I think he's spot on with others that have said we're probably too risk averse and that we ought to kind of go a little bit back to taking on a little bit more risk, making decisions, not going through processes or committees to make those decisions. So I think it's great. Not sure exactly all of the organizations that want to follow that model, because remember, it's taken us decades to get to where we're this risk averse. It will probably take a little bit of time to get out of that mindset. And so part of it is literally taking ownership of the program, not only from what I'll say is the engineering baseline, but the business baseline. Again, I think there's all too often we focus too much on the technical side, saying we're taking too much technical risk, but at the same time, I think we're also risk averse when it comes to the business processes. And if we take a little risk on both those areas, I'm not talking about just any kind of risk, I'm talking about managed risk. The teams that have pulled this together, both technically and business side, are the experts. Everybody else out there that says they're the experts, again, they don't know the system like the program managers and the program teams that are pulling this together. So I tell my team, hey, you own it. You know the system better than anybody else. No one that we go see should be able to one-up you, so to speak. And so the best part of this is getting the individuals to own both the technical and business baseline and represent that back to the senior leadership. And it's amazing how fast people make decisions at the senior leadership level when you own both technical and business baselines. Sir?
Everybody can hear me. George Nicholson from the Global Soft Foundation.
Sir?
A couple of years ago, Senator McCain had a series of hearings of the problems of changing the defense structure for acquisitions. Michelle Flournoy, who had been the previous Undersecretary of Defense, one of her key comments she made, the biggest problem we have is the tyranny of consensus. The next month, I was over at the National Press Club, and Mac Thornberry said exactly the same thing.
Right.
Do you see anything being done to solve this issue of the tyranny of consensus?
Yeah, you see pockets of it. I kind of mentioned a few of those, and one, trying to relabel offices out there that are more, RCO-like. Space was one, Army was one. See, I think you see the pockets out there that are trying to break that down, but the consensus folks still exist. The regulations are piled high in the Department of Defense, and again, if you choose to go through all of that, then you're destined to a very long program. And so you don't have to. I mean, have you seen the, I'll call it the Defense Systems Acquisition Cycle? It has both the requirements on there, it has acquisition, it has a whole slew of things. This chart's like this big, and it's an eye chart even if it's blown up, the size of a 4x8 sheet of plywood. If you look at it closely, there's areas in there you'd say, oh, I'm going to follow that. That makes sense. But there's other areas in there. They have these little do loops. There's little vortices in there. You want to avoid those. The key is, and I mentioned this earlier, we follow 5,000, but we are in tune. We resonate with the tailoring and the streamlining portions, and that literally is codified in our charter. And so when people come in and say, hey, Waldo, you got to come see us. And I go, all right, well, let me refer to the charter. If I don't see their name in it, I say, nope, no, don't have to. And so it becomes very simple. And again, this is natural. Human tendency is, hey, we're important. You got to come see us. The answer is no, not all the time. And the key here is acquisition, and I'll pick on that, but even requirements should not be viewed as a cookie cutter, where if you just apply one regulation next thing you know, it's going to be perfect because it worked on another program. Now, each program's different, should be handled differently. The decisions that are made should be handled differently, elevated to the folks that know the system and know what you want to go do as opposed to everybody. Because if you go to everybody, you'll get a whole bunch of opinions out there that may or may not matter. And you want to avoid the ones that don't matter. Those are the ones that slow you down. So hopefully that answered the question.
So is there a good reason to do it the slower way, ever?
Well, I don't know. It depends. Depends on the program.
So are there good, compelling reasons sometimes to do it the slower way?
Well, so you're trying to add a relative term to something that's hypothetical. So I'll put this out there. And again, I'm thinking more of weapon systems. I always challenge folks out there that tell me, hey, well, you get this all screwed up. I go, oh, then you must know how long it takes to build a B-21. Just let me know what that is, and I'm ready to write it down. Or you know how much it costs. So tell me what that number is so I don't have to spend some valuable time, not only in the Department of Defense, but also on the Hill, explaining what the cost value is. So again, there's a relative term in here, and you know, there is no crystal ball on what each program will cost and all of the underlying problems that you will find, because they will be there. The key is, once you find them, is not spend an inordinate amount of time hand-wringing over what you should do next. Get the engineering folks in there to come up with the options that literally make sense, and then make a decision. Roll that up to the seniors. And I'm not just referring to the seniors in the Defense Department, but also the seniors on the Hill. Let them know what you're doing. Hey, here's the problem we found. Here's the options we had to fix. Notice the cost associated with it. Here's the decision we need. And it's amazing when you're at that level of transparency, people help. They love it. In fact, sometimes provide opinion back. You go, oh, that makes sense. We ought to go put that into one of the options. Hopefully that helped answer it. I know I didn't answer precisely going slow. Of course, I'm not going to go slow. I'm going to go at the right speed, the correct speed. Sir?
Hi, Mark Sellinger with Defense Daily. Can you tell us a little bit about what the future holds for the X-37? Are you going to continue with the existing vehicle and these long flights? Or are you going to perhaps develop a new variant or do different types of flights? And I was also wondering if you could talk about any cyber security for the B-21. I mean, China keeps trying to steal U.S. weapons secrets. Are there any special things that you're doing to protect the B-21, which I assume would be very desired by them?
Mm-hmm. X-37 is doing quite well. We fly roughly 2 years. You've seen that on most of the launches and then recoveries. I don't see a big change coming. It's working quite well. The experimentation we're doing has been very helpful to others out there in the space community. And again, we touch in different areas. NASA's flown some things, experiments on there. We flew, I think the last mission had AHF a thruster on there. So again, we're working some components in an environment that makes sense and providing that feedback to the organizations that need it to make their systems, I'll say, less risky, but at the same time deliver hopefully on time for them. So X-37 is doing well. Mission 5 is doing well. Most likely will be up there for about 2 years. Expect to see it come back on or about a year from now-ish. And again, depending on how well it's doing on this experimentation, we could come back earlier or stay a little bit longer. But I don't see much change with respect to X-37. But like any system out there, it starts getting old. And you have diminishing manufacturing issues you have to work. We're working those today. And it's no different from any other system that you have to manage. And so right now, we don't see a big change coming in the near term. B-21, absolutely. There's adversaries out there want to know what we're doing and are probably going to great lengths to try to get to that level of insight, and we're doing everything we can to prevent it. Ma'am?
Hi, Valerie Insina with Defense News. A couple months ago, like around March timeframe, Congressman Whitman said that there were some problems with the B-21's engine, some airflow issues, and he said that they were, relatively minor hiccups. But I was wondering if you could give an update on whether those issues had been solved.
Yes. Yes, they've been solved. No, again, complex weapon systems, especially engine integration, you know, I won't go into too much aerodynamics, but you've got to get, you know, the throat sizes done right. And prior to anything that's being built, it's predictive. So engineering predictions are made, you go in there, and the moment you start getting some insight into actual testing, lab testing, is it informs you on what the answer should be. So back to making a decision. Once we had that data, it was fairly easy to go, here's the path we're on.
So it sounds like you guys have been doing some physical testing. Is that at the component level? Like, you know, what level of testing are you guys doing right now?
We have to start with components because the airplane's not built yet. So yes, natural development of a complex weapon system like the B-21, as you start what I would say is the component level work that leads into the integrated work, that leads into full flight test, that leads into operational test, and then into production and such. But yeah, we're in that phase today of getting a good feel for each of the components, how they're going to be integrated in, and the engineering associated with that integration. Okay. Kevin?
Kevin Walker, Aerospace Corporation. Can you compare and contrast the rapid acquisition processes used by the RCO with the rapid prototyping and rapid fielding that was described in Section 804 of the NDAA language? And did the RCO have anything to do with the drafting of that language?
We did not have anything to do with the drafting of the Section 804. Like any tool, because Section 804 is one of those tools, it's got limits on there. If it makes sense for the program you're going to go do, use Section 804. The tools that exist today in the FAR and DFAR, you know, contracting mechanisms between OTAs, cost plus, fixed price type contract tools, they work quite well. My office has always used either a cost plus or a fixed price. We haven't used those other tools, don't need to do it. And again, not to say we're more traditional, but the bottom line is, if you're going to go on contract, pick the tool that makes sense for what you're going to go build, and then execute that contract. And it doesn't mean once you drop a contract, you're done. All too often, I would say the old acquisition mindset is, well, they're on contract. They got to build to that. That's not how it works. Again, the cost estimates, the schedule estimates that go into a complex weapon system may or may not be the perfect choice at the time you made that decision. So I think you have to be prepared to use the knob in contracting to adjust the contract to meet the real program that you're executing. And that could be, you know, an engineering change proposal. They come in, ECPs is what they call them. Bottom line is you should be willing, because you're doing program management, not just program execution, that management part may say, hey, let's go do some work in changing the contract to execute what you really intend to go do, as opposed to, I have a contract and I'm done and now let's just hold their feet to the fire. That rarely works, because then you usually get, hey, I'll just pick on some of the folks out there from industry. The moment they find that there's some issues with the contract and execution, and you say go hire more people, and of course more people is more money for them to go spend, they're going to push back and say nope, and next thing you know, you're having a slip to the program because they didn't have the right sized people coming in. Maybe you make a change to the contract that makes sense for the execution of the program that you're trying to build and deliver to the warfighter. I think that answered the question. Any more questions? Sir?
I could just follow up on one of the earlier questions about the B-21. Do you have a model yet of the plane, and is it in wind tunneling? Have you put it in a wind tunnel?
Yes, we have a model, and yes, we've been in a wind tunnel.
Can you say what size the model is and which wind tunnel?
No.
Say which wind tunnel?
No.
No, okay.
But there's not many wind tunnels in the U.S. that you can't turn to and get a feel for the size of the wind tunnel. But suffice it to say, like any aircraft program that's going to go through development, you're going to do wind tunnel testing. And we're no different. You're going to go from an estimate on a piece of paper and drawings to the right things it would take to get you to build out the system, and wind tunnel testing is one of them. And we're following that logic. because it makes sense from an engineering point of view. All right. Any final thoughts or questions? Sir?
Given the emphasis on systems engineering, how useful has your office found a lot of the simulation work and the rest? I mean, you're talking about, well, you still have to do wind tunnel, you still have to build stuff. Are those things making a substantive difference on many of your programs?
My program's probably no different from other programs out there being built. So if the tool makes sense for the program that you're executing, then absolutely use it. Doesn't mean, again, back to the cookie cutter, doesn't mean everything that's a simulator should be used for the particular weapon that you're building. So absolutely use the right tool that makes sense in the developmental phase you're in to inform what the next phase would look like. So we do simulation. We do testing. All of that takes place in that complex systems engineering of building a weapon system. And B-21 is one of those examples.
But broadly speaking, have those kinds of tools made much of a difference to help you speed things, perhaps skip some testing?
No, I've not seen that.
Okay.
Again, there's an estimate, there's simulation or predictions, and again they're going to be as close as you can make them, but most are still off. And then you've got to get into the test phase. In my mind, you got to get the testing done in a manner that, one, informs not only the models you used, but more important, informs what you believe that first production bird is really going to look like and what changes have to take place based on going from prediction to test feedback. So to me, the test feedback, and maybe I'm biased because I'm a test guy, but the test feedback really does get to those deficiencies, not just the aerodynamics piece, but the systems, the mission systems out there that you're actually trying to integrate on. That feedback, in my mind, gives you that first sense of how well you predicted, how you did the software and the integration with the hardware. That insight, in my mind, is a feedback loop that's absolutely required. So. All right. Well, thank you for your time. This has been very good. Awesome. Dave, thank you.